He walks into a swamp and lets something drink his blood. Before dawn, in the cold shallows of a marsh, a man rolls his trousers and sleeves back to the bare skin and stands still in the black water, waiting to be bitten. Soon, the small dark worms find his legs, fasten on, and begin to swell. He lets them feed, then peels them off one by one, drops them in a jar, and wades back in for more. When each one lets go, the skin keeps bleeding for hours. A good day is 500 worms. The worms are leeches, and the man feeding them is not mad, and not there by accident. This is a trade, with customers waiting on dry land. The barber, the surgeon, the hospital physician, none of whom would ever wade into a marsh to fetch their own. This was the leech collector, one of the strangest jobs medicine ever leaned on. Strange for what it cost the body that did it. Stranger still for where these small creatures ended up, and for how the whole trade came apart in the end. The idea was older than almost any other in medicine. Its first surviving trace is not a picture, but a line of verse, a Greek poem on poisons and their antidotes, written by Nicander of Colophon somewhere around 130 BC, in which leeches are fastened to the skin to draw the blood off. Within a century or two, physicians in India were writing the same instructions into Sanskrit. Scholars still argue over which came first. That argument is the point. No one can name the beginning. The practice was already 2,000 years old, and its origin already lost when the doctors of 19th century London were still doing exactly the same thing. Behind those verses lay a single idea, and it would outlast every empire that ever held it, that illness was bad blood, and that to heal a person was to let the bad blood out. This was not the superstition at the edge of medicine. For the better part of 2,000 years, it was medicine. The Greeks built it into a system. The body ran on 4 fluids, 4 humours, and sickness was their imbalance, corrected by drawing off whatever ran to excess. In Rome, Galen made bleeding the standard answer to almost any complaint, and his word governed European medicine for over 1,000 years after his death. When learning faded in the medieval West, the same knowledge was kept and refined in the Islamic world and carried back into Europe through translation. The theory crossed continents and centuries and never lost its grip, and of every method ever devised for letting blood, the leech was the gentlest. No blade, no cut, no spring-loaded lancet snapping into a vein, just a creature that fastened on and drew the blood off by itself, quietly, from the places a knife could never safely reach: a nostril, a lip, the gum, the soft skin behind the ear. For the delicate work, nothing else came close. But here was the catch. A physician knew when to bleed a patient, and where, and how much. Galen had left rules for all of it. What he did not have was the creature itself. No doctor kept a swamp behind his house. The leech had to be found, and caught, and kept alive. And that was no part of medicine at all. It was wet, cold, poorly paid work, done far from any bedside, by people whose names no history troubled to record. The physician owned the knowledge. Someone else had to walk into the marsh and bleed for the supply. The people who did this work were not doctors and never became rich. They were the rural poor, and very often women. When the Yorkshire artist George Walker drew the trade in 1814, the leech gatherers he showed were Scottish women, skirts hitched up, standing in the shallows. In France, the same figure was a man in a woolen cap, bare-armed and bare-legged, pale from the work. In Italy, he had his own name, the Mignatero. Whoever they were, the method was the same, and it was the plainest method imaginable. Walk into the water and wait to be bitten. They waded into ponds and bogs and slow marsh channels, trousers and skirts rolled back, and let the leeches come to the warmth of their skin. Some carried a peeled willow wand to stir the mud and rouse the creatures. Some drove an old horse into the water ahead of them, too worn out for any other use, to draw the leeches first. Every few minutes they stopped, checked their own legs, pulled off the ones that had latched and swollen, and dropped them into a jar or a bag. Then they waded back in. A good day was around 500 leeches, and it was seasonal because in the cold months the leeches would not feed, so the work and the wage vanished with the season. The body paid for every hour of it. A leech does not simply take blood. Its bite keeps bleeding long after it lets go, so the collectors bled from their own legs for hours, day after day. They lost enough blood over a season to leave them weak and grey. They took infections from the filthy water and from the bites themselves. The marsh gave them fevers, catarrh, rheumatism, ulcers where the leeches had fed. It was one of the few trades where the raw material was drawn, quite literally, out of the worker's own body. And the catch was only the start of the chain. From the collector, the leeches passed to dealers, sometimes called leech women, who carried them by the thousand into the towns, packed in damp moss and soil, to be sold on to the people who actually needed them. By the 1830s, that buyer was usually not the physician, but the apothecary, whose shop window held tall, ornate jars marked leeches, filled with rainwater and moss, restocked each morning with the number he expected to sell that day. A leech was not cheap and not used once. After a feeding, the creature was made to disgorge the blood and then starved for weeks until it was hungry enough to work again. Because the demand was enormous, it reached into every kind of life. Leeches were set on peasants and set on the rich, on infants and on the dying, for fevers, headaches, sore throats, swellings, madness, for very nearly anything a body could suffer. They were carried into hospitals by the tens of thousands and kept in the cupboards of ordinary homes. And behind every one of them, at the very bottom of this vast and respectable edifice of medicine, was a person standing knee-deep in a cold marsh, feeding a worm on their own blood so that someone, somewhere, could be bled. For most of its history, the trade had ticked along at the steady pace of ordinary medicine. Then, in the first decades of the 19th century, it exploded, and the explosion had a single face. A French army doctor named François-Joseph Victor Broussais came home from the Napoleonic campaigns with one enormous idea, that there were not many diseases but one, that every fever and every ailment was at root a single thing, inflammation, and that the cure for inflammation was to draw the blood off the inflamed part. And the instrument for that, gentle and precise, was the leech. It was a theory a child could grasp, and it needed no skill to apply, and it swept medicine like a fever of its own. Broussais set leeches on his patients by the dozen, often before he had even made a diagnosis. He set them on himself for his own indigestion. He even bled his fighting cocks once a week. Between 1830 and 1836, his hospital alone worked through more than 2 million leeches. And where the master led, all of medicine followed. In London, St. Thomas's Hospital used about 1,600 leeches in 1815. 7 years later, it used over 50,000. In 1832, at the peak, France imported more than 57 million of them in a single year. Across Europe, the figure ran into hundreds of millions, every one of them a small dark worm that had to be pulled, alive, from a marsh by somebody's cold hands. And that was the pressure that broke the trade's own foundation. There were not hundreds of millions of leeches to spare. The wild populations, fished without pause to feed the mania, simply began to give out. Ireland was stripped early. By the 1850s, the leech was becoming hard to find anywhere in Britain, and the collectors had to range further and further for a thinner and thinner catch. The wetlands of the Ottoman Empire became a last great reservoir. taxed and worked for export, and even those were drawn down hard. The most ordinary medical supply in Europe was being hunted to extinction. A witness to that vanishing had already appeared, quietly, at the very start of it. In the autumn of 1800, on a road near Grasmere in the English Lake District, the poet William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy met an old man bent almost double in an apron and a nightcap, who had gathered leeches all his life and had just given it up. Dorothy wrote down what he told them. Leeches were scarce that year for the dry season, but they had been scarce for years, and he supposed it was because they had been too much sought after and bred slowly. He said it plainly, without complaint, an old beggar on a road giving the cause of his own ruin in a sentence. Wordsworth made a poem of him 2 years later, and in the poem the old man is still out on the moor, still working, still finding them, which is the version the world remembers. It is one of the few times the leech collector speaks in the historical record at all, and what he reports, a century before the science caught up with him, is not a dry summer. It is that they had taken too many. The thing that finally killed the trade was not pity for the collectors, and not the near extinction of the leech. It was an idea, the same kind of thing that had built the mania in the first place. Medicine simply stopped believing that bad blood was the problem. The doubt came first from counting. In Paris, a physician named Pierre Louis did something almost no one had thought to do in 2,000 years of bleeding patients. He kept records. He compared the sick who had been bled with the sick who had not, and the numbers refused to show what everyone knew to be true. The bled did not do better. For a treatment that had been the reflex of all medicine since Galen, that was a quiet catastrophe, the first hard evidence that the great remedy did very little at all. Then the ground gave way entirely. Across the middle of the century, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch built the case that disease was not a matter of humours running to excess, but of living organisms, germs, invisible, invading the body from outside. If sickness came from a microbe, then draining a patient's blood did nothing to the cause. It only left them weaker to fight it. The whole 2,000-year edifice that had made the leech a medical necessity, the humours, the balance, the bad blood let out through the skin, was not reformed. It was abandoned. What had been the height of medicine became the mark of the quack, and when the theory died, the trade died with it, from the top down. Doctors put the leech aside. The apothecary's great gilded jars went cold, and at the very bottom of the chain, the demand that had sent people wading into cold water for a living simply evaporated. The collector, who had never owned the knowledge, only supplied the creature, had no theory to defend and no living to fall back on. The physician moved on to the next idea. The person in the marsh was left with wet legs, a thinning catch, and a trade that no longer existed. By the end of the century, the job was effectively gone, and the leech itself, hunted to the edge of extinction and now wanted by no one, was left to disappear in peace. There is the first turn of the story. The craft was not destroyed by its cruelty, or its filth, or the toll it took on the bodies that worked it. It was destroyed by the science that had once crowned it. The moment medicine looked honestly at its oldest cure and found nothing there. And that should have been the end. A dead theory, a dead trade, a creature hunted to the edge of extinction and wanted by no one. Except the leech had never actually stopped working. The theory behind it had been wrong for 2,000 years, but the animal itself was doing something real. And in 1884, a doctor named John Haycraft found out what. He discovered that the leech's saliva carried a powerful substance that stopped blood from clotting, a natural anticoagulant, which he named hirudine, after the leech's Latin name. The old healers had been right about the effect and wrong about the reason. The leech was not balancing anyone's humours. It was, quietly and precisely, keeping blood flowing. For a long time, that stayed a mere curiosity. Then medicine changed in a way no 19th century physician could have imagined. Surgeons learned to sew severed parts back onto the body. Fingers, ears, lips, flaps of skin, reconnecting vessels finer than thread under a microscope. And they ran into a wall. The arteries, thick and strong, could be stitched back and made to pump blood in. But the veins, delicate and collapsible, were far harder to reconnect. And if the blood could not drain back out, it pooled in the reattached part until the tissue swelled, darkened, and died. A surgeon could give a patient back a finger, then watch it turn black for want of a way to let the old blood escape. There was a tool that did exactly that job, one that drew off pooled blood at a precise spot and kept it running with a natural anticoagulant, long enough for the body to grow its own new veins. It had been sitting in the marshes the whole time. In 1960, 2 Slovenian surgeons reported using leeches to save a congested flap. In 1985, an American surgeon, faced with a 5-year-old whose ear had been bitten off and was slowly dying after reattachment because the tiny veins kept failing, ordered live leeches and set them to the ear, and it lived. The case made headlines, and the oldest tool in medicine walked back through the door it had been thrown out of. In 2004, the United States government made it official. It approved the medicinal leech for sale as a medical device. Not an antique, not a folk remedy. A device regulated and prescribed, one of the very few living animals a modern surgeon can order to a hospital bed. The creature that Victorian doctors had discarded as the badge of the quack was now grown in clean laboratory farms, kept hungry in refrigerated chambers, and flown to operating theatres around the world to do the one thing no pump or drug does quite as well. The job is gone and will not come back. But the creature it chased is in the operating room right now, still doing the only thing it ever did, drinking blood and keeping it flowing.